Now that we know how to graph in the coordinate plane, let's talk about reflecting. So we're going to start with the point that we have in our notes from earlier, which is at 2, 5 in the first quadrant where both coordinates are positive. We're going to call this point point A. If I want to reflect this point, I need to know where I'm reflecting it from. So let's start by reflecting over the y-axis. So I want to reflect over the y-axis, which remember is the vertical up and down axis. That's like if I folded my paper in half and creased it at the y-axis and poked a hole through where point A would be, where would the new hole end up on the other side? So this hole would end up at -2, 5. What we notice is that it's the same distance. So if I were to fold my paper in half, it's going to take me 2 units to get over to A, and it's going to take me 2 units to get over to the reflection of A, which we write like this, and we read as A prime. Okay, so A prime is the reflection of A over, in this case, the y-axis. If I instead wanted to reflect A over the x-axis, which remember is the horizontal side-to-side axis, I'm going to do the same thing except folding on the x-axis. So point A would end up the same distance but opposite direction from the x-axis. So in this case, I'm 5 units to the x-axis, so I need to go 5 units in the other direction. It doesn't matter where I reflected, I would still call the reflection point A prime. But keep in mind that if I reflected over the x-axis, I'm going to end up down here in quadrant 4, whereas when I reflected over the y-axis, I ended up in quadrant 2. If I wanted to reflect point A over both the x and y-axis, I could start in either direction, so I could go the y-axis first and then reflect that point over the x-axis, or I could reflect over the x-axis first, end up at A prime, and reflect that point over the y-axis. We would call this point a double prime because it's been reflected 2 times, once over the x and once over the y. If I were to reflect the point over the same axis 2 times, where do you think I might end up? So let's write down a couple of notes before we go. We have, if I reflect over the y-axis, I have the same distance from the y-axis in the opposite direction. So remember that was this one. So I started with A, reflected over the y-axis, and ended up at -2, 5. What do you notice about the change in the coordinates that I have? If I instead reflect over the x-axis, that means I'm the same distance from the x-axis, but the opposite direction. That was when I ended up down here at 2, -5. What do you notice about the change in the coordinates of that point? See if you can answer those questions about what you notice about the changes in coordinates, and then you can move on to the next activity.